Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Peril. On the show tonight.
You don't want to help save the country? Get out of the way.
The president's priorities are getting pared down as Democrats duke it out.
After a volatile presidential transition, including the January 6th Capitol riot, does peril remain? Author Robert Costa weighs in.
Divisive and extremist behaviors we see today are only the beginning.
Whistleblower Frances Haugen gives powerful testimony about Facebook's alleged greed. Plus, there was a major outage that crippled Facebook's platforms.
And a look at the future of cities, Chicago in particular, in a post-COVID and climate change challenged world. But first, some of today's top stories. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx is responding in person today to the mayor's criticism from yesterday that Foxx's office should be bringing criminal charges against the people involved in a deadly West Side shootout Friday morning. Today, Foxx called for an end to finger-pointing and trying cases in the media, saying the mayor's comments yesterday could jeopardize any future charges that come from the shooting.
Not for a political stunt, not for a pressing. There's a shootout in Austin. Our number one concern should be about getting those people prosecuted, not a headline diverting attention away from the fact that we have not had a comprehensive plan for violence in the city of Chicago.
Yesterday, during an unrelated event, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, a former federal prosecutor herself, said she believes, based on what she's heard from CPD detectives, that there is enough evidence for charges. Parents of Chicago public school students will be able to send their kids back to school sooner if they have to quarantine because of a close contact to a positive case in school. New school CEO Pedro Martinez made the announcement today alongside CDPH Commissioner Dr. Allison Arwady. He says students will only need to quarantine for 10 days instead of 14, and that starts this Saturday. Martinez also said the district is now up to surveillance testing in nearly all schools.
The challenge, though, is that as I'm seeing more and more consent forms being signed, again, the real question right now is how quick can we ramp up as as we're getting more and more individuals wanting to get tested. And so that's the challenge. Now, again, I'm heartened by the fact that we went from just under 8,000 tests to 15,000 tests.
And Dr. Allison Arwady says so far, fewer than 2% of students who are in a close contact with a positive case ever test positive themselves. Actor Jussie Smollett will stand trial starting late next month, nearly 3 years after his arrest for allegedly orchestrating a hoax attack on himself. A Cook County judge today said jury selection in a high-profile case will begin on November 27th. Smollett faces felony disorderly conduct charges for falsely claiming he was attacked near his Streeterville apartment in the winter of 2019. While he was charged at the time, the Cook County State's Attorney dismissed those charges in a widely scrutinized move. A special prosecutor is pursuing the current charges. Up next, the latest from Capitol Hill with local members of Congress. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Congress has 2 weeks to avoid defaulting on American debt by lifting the debt ceiling. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden's priorities are being pared down a bit in the $3.5 trillion social spending bill amid infighting among Democrats. Will the two factions in that party reach compromise? Joining us now to talk about that and much more are Congressman Bill Foster, a Democrat from Naperville, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, a Democrat from Matson, Congresswoman Marie Newman, a Democrat from Chicago's Southwest Side, and Congressman Mike Quigley, a Democrat from Chicago's North Side. We invited all the Republicans in Illinois' congressional delegation. None accepted our invitation tonight, but we do thank the four of you for being back here with us. Representative Kelly, I'll start with you. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned of a possible recession if action on the debt ceiling isn't taken. Is it possible that political gridlock will lead to defaulting on the U.S. debt?
Well, I always say I'm an optimist, so I believe that we are going to get this done. I don't think the Republicans want to be blamed for it because it would be their fault if we didn't get it done. So I believe that we are going to get this done.
All right, and let's hear from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He said Democrats will need to go it alone, raising the debt limit using the reconciliation process. And here's what two Senate leaders said yesterday about that.
We aren't asking Republicans to vote yes, even though it's debt that they incurred. We are simply asking that they get out of the way.
The majority doesn't need our votes. They just want a bipartisan shortcut around procedural hurdles.
Representative Newman, obviously this is in the other chamber, but do you think Republicans there are going to stick with threats of filibustering a debt ceiling vote?
I think that they very well could. Again, I'm an optimist too, like Robin. I hope that they'll take the moral and conscious and prudent path and pass it with us and join us and do what's right for Americans. But we never know.
Congressman, quickly, do you see any end game here? Are there any talks behind the scenes of what the end game of this is?
Look, I don't know what negotiations you can have. This is the full faith and credit of the United States government at stake. National, international markets are at stake. You have to take responsibility. I'm perhaps not as optimistic. This is a new breed of Republican we're dealing with here who thinks that gamble's okay, even though they're what patriarch Ronald Reagan said, that doing this is unconscionable, and he strongly advised against doing anything so dangerous.
All right, so this is all occurring as debate goes on the two major pieces of the president's economic agenda. The infrastructure bill was pulled last week. Congressman Bill Foster, the president has had meetings on Capitol Hill with congressmen. What have those meetings been like?
Well, look, he just reminded us that we're all in this together as Democrats. And the infighting, the quote-unquote infighting among House members is not really infighting. It's just a discussion over tactics. You know, the frustration is with a couple of senators who I think are misreading what is the best for the people that they represent and are trying to whittle down something that is supported by a vast majority of Americans. And so the House will do what is necessary to get both of these passed. And I hope that the Senate does likewise.
Congresswoman Kelly, is it still the case that these two bills, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then that larger social spending bill, are linked, or could they be voted on separate? Congresswoman Kelly, I don't know if you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you. I just cut off. I could see both ways. I could see them being voted on separate. I think negotiations are going on right now between, if you want to say, the two different opinions in the Democratic caucus, or they could be together. I kind of see them more separate but close together, not together. But I'm really not sure because, things change all the time. But I know the speaker wants the bills called by the end of the month.
And Congresswoman Newman, you're part of the Progressive Caucus here. It seems like there's consensus that the final tally here won't be $3.5 trillion. It will have to come down. So what remains in this bill and what gets left out?
What's important is it's not about the number at all. What's important is that we have our priorities in there, the caring network and affordable housing, climate action, pathway to citizenship and more, making sure that we have access to health care for our seniors and bring drug prices down, lowering taxes. Those are our priorities and cutting child poverty. So getting our priorities in there is very important. The number is less important. There are things that we can do to accommodate a negotiation. And that's what this is. We all have to remember this is a really large and longer than we wanted negotiation. And when you do that, everybody has to compromise. And we're all willing to do this. We're even hearing today that Senator Sinema and Mr. Manchin are giving in a little. So I think there's good progress.
And those, of course, are the two moderates in the Senate that have been opposed, at least to the $3.5 trillion number. So, Congressman Quigley, is there an idea of what those two senators would agree to that could also get agreement from progressives?
Look, I think one of the things that the president said to us in caucus was, if you don't compromise, you get zero. In the end, the Democratic Party, it's a big tent, but in the final analysis, we usually get these things done. This is a chance to really change things. Gandhi wrote that a true measure of society is how we handle our most vulnerable. This extends the child tax credit, pulling half of them out of poverty, and it also expands Medicare for seniors to include dental and vision. So it's a big moment. I think they'll come to those terms.
And we mentioned the leader of the House Progressive Caucus sounded optimistic about this bill's prospects. Take a look.
6 minutes, 6 days, 6 weeks, we're going to get this done. We need a little time to negotiate. There was a lot of time to negotiate the infrastructure bill, and there were skeptics like me who said, I don't think it's going to get done, and I was wrong. I'm happy to be wrong about that. Now we need a little time to negotiate on this Build Back Better Act, and I believe we will be able to do that.
Congressman Foster, what do you see as the elements in a final bill here that those two senators would agree to that would also get agreement from progressives?
Well, the baseline proposal, the $3.5 trillion proposal, is honestly paid for. And it puts in place things that will permanently change for the better the lives of families in the United States. And so what we're going to be forced to, if we're forced to a lower top line number, is that we're going to have to go to higher risk strategies to make some of these benefits time out in order to make the 10-year number a little bit smaller. We're going to have to do things that we prefer not to do on appropriately paying for these on the necessary time scale. And so there'll be more, and my worry is there'll be more sort of shenanigans in how you score this thing instead of the honest, solid, fully paid for proposition that is really President Biden's plan.
And Congresswoman Kelly, how is it paid for? Do we have a better understanding of that, especially since the president says it's raising taxes on the highest earners, but Republicans say it'll ding middle-class earners?
Well, anyone making less than $400,000, their taxes will not go up, and then businesses, corporations will start paying their fair share. There are some businesses that have paid nothing, and we have to change that. People and businesses have to pay their fair share, and that's how it will be paid for.
All right, we're going to leave this discussion here for now, but we will be joined again by our guest to discuss more on Democratic holdout Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. But for now, our thanks to Representatives Bill Foster, Robin Kelly, Marie Newman, and Mike Quigley. And now to Brandis for a look at the controversy one social media giant is facing. Brandis.
Paris social media users were stopped in their tracks yesterday as a worldwide outage prevented them from accessing Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And this happened just a day after Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen came forward in an interview with 60 Minutes, alleging the company knew its platform allowed hate, violence, and misinformation to run rampant, yet only cared about the bottom line. Joining us to discuss the social media outage, as well as whistleblower Frances Haugen's Facebook interview and testimony, are Jacob Furst, director of the School of Computing at DePaul University, and Christian Hammond, a computer science professor at Northwestern University. Thanks to you both for joining us. So, Jacob, let's start with you first, please. We know about the social media platforms that experienced this outage yesterday. This is a day after Frances Haugen came forward and revealed herself with her 60 Minutes interview. Do you think this outage was a coincidence?
Not for a moment. No, it's entirely too timely. I expect that Facebook was probably going into some kind of damage control mode, and someone flipped the switch that they shouldn't have, or maybe they actually deliberately shut down to prevent any kind of access while they were in damage control.
Christian Hammond, what's your thought? What's the likelihood the two are related?
I think that there was. I think it was a mistake. It was an accident. I have my own issues with Facebook, but I don't think they're quite Machiavellian enough to show how incredibly powerful they are by turning off the lights. So I think that there's not a deep connection between the two right now.
And Christian, what is your reaction to what Frances Haugen has said?
I think it's something that we, in general, we were all aware of. But for me, the important thing is that we now are having a set of issues that Facebook has, about the decisions Facebook has made, being brought to the fore. And now we can start talking about them, about the nature of the data that they use, the nature of the algorithm itself, and in fact, I think even more important, the nature of the interactions that they help support, which by their nature seem to be quite addictive and in many ways harmful in and of themselves. Independent of hate speech, just keeping people addicted and locked in, and then providing them with content which on the face of it look quite benign, but can actually drive them into a sort of negative impact in terms of their opinion of themselves.
So today, Hogan, she testified before the Senate to demand that the federal government impose regulations on Facebook and other online spaces. Here's a bit of what she said.
These problems are solvable. A safer, free speech respecting, more enjoyable social media is possible. But there's one thing that I hope everyone takes away from these disclosures. It is that Facebook can change, but is clearly not going to do so on its own. My fear is that without action, divisive and extremist behaviors we see today are only the beginning.
And Christian, back to you. You know, when looking at the way social media currently operates, should that content be regulated by the government, and how so?
I actually think that their regulation it makes sense, but the problem is right now, I don't think there's anybody in a position of power in the government who would know what to regulate. I mean, we talk a lot about the hate speech, and you know, you can actually put in filters and you can go out of your way to try to remove that hate speech. But forgetting about hate speech or fake news, there really is this problem of quite truthfully, of addictive interactions, and having people living in a world where they're comparing somebody else's curated version of their experiences against their own, and driving down their self-esteem. And the problem is that when you look at what we need to do, the question is, well, what is really happening? We don't have transparency around data. We don't have transparency around algorithm. We don't understand the nature of the interactions. And so it's very difficult to say this is exactly what we should regulate. But again, this is, we're opening up the conversation. And as long as we can stop talking about just like fake news and realize that that's not the problem. The problem is when you give people what they want, it turns out what they want is more and more sugar in their cereal, and it's bad for them. And you've got to figure out a way to modify that.
Jacob, do you think it's possible to have safe online space?
It is. I disagree with Christian a little bit. I think the big problem is that Facebook content is largely driven from Facebook users. And so, again, it's not just giving people what they want, but allowing them to say what they will. And so it's more than just regulating Facebook. It's also managing how people interact online. And I will agree with Christian in this sense. We know that online behavior is generally bad, right? There are lots of reasons we know why people behave badly online. And again, I think those are the issues that we need to address.
And Jacob, sticking with you, you know, Instagram is the other piece of the puzzle this week. Some claiming it is the source of harm for young girls, and we're learning more about what people believe is happening there. How can we keep young women safe online?
Yeah, Christian nailed it. I think is the curated experiences that we see online are not the real experiences, but our first reaction to them is that they are real. I mean, this is reality TV, right? It's not scripted, so it must actually be real, when in fact it's not. And so, right, okay, I'll give you the easy answer, shut down Instagram, but this doesn't solve any problems at all, right? We really need to understand how people are experiencing it, both as consumers and producers, and understand how to manage the discrepancies that exist.
And, you know, we've got about 45 seconds left, but Christian, you know, what might social media look like in the future if we see some changes come of this?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a little thing that happens when you're watching Netflix and you're binging too long. It asks you if you're still watching, and make sure that you haven't you're just watching blindly. And I think that for social media, I mean, the engagement is what the companies want, but finding ways to actually limit that engagement, which means not making as much money, but limiting that engagement and making sure that the engagement is not addictive, is not aiming harmful, although it looks benign, content at them, and making sure that we understand that we can't ask people to be responsible for themselves if what we're doing is actually building systems that strip them of that responsibility. And so the future, I think the future of social media is questionable. And we've got to disconnect the business model from addictive and harmful behaviors.
Okay, a complicated question for a very complicated topic. My thanks to our guests, Jacob First and Christian Hammond, for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And later in the program, we'll hear more from local members of Congress and their take on regulating Facebook. But first, a look at the future of cities in a post-COVID and climate change challenged world. That's right after this. Spend Saturday evening with the Voices of Chicago. Latino voices at 6 and Black voices at 6:30. See you on Saturdays. This month, the University of Chicago is hosting its third Urban October to focus on the issue of improving urban life for the billions of people that live in cities around the world. This in the wake of a pandemic that has exposed inequities around the globe and certainly here in Chicago. The goal is to help focus attention on the work that's being done to transform the cities of the future and Chicago in particular in a post-COVID and world that's changed by challenged by climate change. Now, joining us now to share their thoughts are three University of Chicago specialists. Amaya Pawar, former alderman of the 47th Ward, who is now a senior advisor at UChicago's Inclusive Economy Lab. Sabina Sheck, director of UChicago's program on the global environment. And Louis Betancourt, director of the university's Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. Thanks to all of you for joining us. So, Amaya Pawar, welcome back. Let's start with you, please. What lessons should the city be taking from this pandemic in order to, we hear this phrase a lot, in order to build back better?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think that's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway that we can learn from a pandemic that laid bare these connected crises of poverty, inequality, the racial wealth gap, and climate change is that when you provide people with unprecedented amount of aid, cash, and you reform systems like SNAP, you change the relationships between landlords and tenants, and you lift every community up, that you create more resilient communities. And what we've actually seen over the last 2 years or so since the pandemic started is poverty rates decrease because of unprecedented help. And I think the city should be propelling those efforts with guaranteed income, with public options for housing and banking and childcare, and continue this work to rebuild and build back better.
Louis Betancourt, you know, one impact of the pandemic is to have accelerated a trend towards more people working from home, fewer people working downtown. Do you think that is likely to be a permanent change? And if that's the case, how should cities be planning for the future with that in mind?
Yes, well, thank you. I think it's an excellent question. We're still, seeing how it pans out. But basically, cities are built out of this balance between where people live and where people work. And increasing over the last decades, we've separated those spaces more and more with larger and larger suburbs. So what happened, of course, during the pandemic is that a lot of office work that happens downtown, and particularly in Chicago happens downtown, is now not happening there. And so we're seeing vacancy rates in the Loop, in some parts of the Loop at least. They're about 30 or 40% only of occupancy, so the rest is unoccupied. And that really is a major transformation if it persists for the city. And this is happening throughout many other cities in the world that are well equipped with, better equipped with technology. So you have to imagine sort of the sort of knockdown effects of that, not only for real estate, for services, for the maintenance of sort of city life and sort of the web of social life, civic life, and businesses that kind of hold the city together. So it's potentially a large crisis. It's also a crisis that may have repercussions that are a little slower, and they have to do with the capacity of businesses in the city to innovate by maintaining these networks of interaction, which we know are critical for how cities work. So we have to see how this pans out, but it asks for cities to think about possibly all these spaces that become vacant. We have other vacant spaces in the city, as we know, and including here in the South Side, and really be proactive and imaginative about how we can create new uses that can create both better living conditions for people and innovation value.
And so we tend to see the most visible impacts of climate change. They tend to be in coastal communities, in areas of drought that have been hit by wildfires, for example. But Sabina Sheck, over to you. A city like ours, what are some of the most profound challenges that climate change presents for Chicago?
Hi, yes, thank you. Well, that's a good question. And I think we're already living some of these impacts of climate change. So we need to stop thinking about it as some far off, abstract, uncertain future. So obviously these impacts are much more visible in other cities. As you mentioned, in Chicago, we don't see those coastal surges or wildfires, but we're already living with the predictions for Chicago, which are more extreme and intense rain and heat events. And that's going to continue to become more frequent. I think that maybe people don't realize sometimes that heat waves are the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, and particularly vulnerable are people who are living in places without cooling infrastructure, whether that's air conditioning and modern building design or natural sources like trees and green spaces that can reduce those urban heat effects.
So, Amaya Poor, back over to you. You told our producer that the multiple crises of poverty, inequality, and climate change have laid bare the shortcomings of neoliberal economic orthodoxy and the philanthropic model. It is a mouthful, but what do you mean by that?
Well, so you have people who are benefiting, people, banks, corporations, who essentially use their power and money to write the rules of the economy, and then use philanthropy to try to address the externality. So in other words, they benefit from inequality in a system that helps them get richer, and they then control what cities and states can do through their philanthropy. And I just think that what we need is a new economic paradigm, one that prioritizes workers, one that prioritizes communities, and one that, we've had before. Before, neoliberalism, we had the New Deal economics, which really prioritized people and communities. And I think it's time to go back to those kinds of ideas and really participate in the markets. Instead of letting the markets do to us and then let philanthropists decide what we can get as a result, I think cities should participate in the markets. And that's why I believe in public options for banking and housing and broadband and childcare.
Louis Betancourt, one thing that's constantly part of the conversation about living in Chicago is, of course, the subject of violence. Is that something that we know that it's something that has driven many people out of the city, but how do urban planners, futurists, how do they think about that as an issue?
Well, it's obviously a existential, very difficult problem in Chicago and many other cities, particularly in the U.S. But it's a problem that many cities also have largely solved or mitigated. And including in the U.S., but certainly internationally. So it's something that we have to think that if we engage with systemically, we should be able to certainly create better conditions. It's a systemic problem. I think we often want, particularly in our political discourse, to either take simple solutions of law enforcement, of social equity, but the places that have done well have actually created systems where both law enforcement is true conflict resolution. It feels like it advances fairness and justice, and at the same time, of course, there's sort of living conditions that are dignified, where people, are healthy. They can be creative agents in society, and therefore, have other plans in life and other outlets for their energies and creative power. So in some sense, this has been the way that over time, takes about a decade or two, that problem has been addressed, and it can be addressed. But I think it requires creating a system around the issue of the kind that we don't have at the moment.
And Sabina Sheck, if flooding and intense heat events, if those are becoming more common, what can the city do to try and mitigate some of those impacts?
Yeah, well, I think that we have to realize that these are not one-off events. What we just saw happen, the heat wave in Seattle and Portland, which was, unprecedented, or the flooding in New York about a month ago, the energy grid load in Texas. So I think we have to, I said this the last time I was on the show a couple months ago, but I'll say it again, that we have to really reconsider our traditional definitions of infrastructure, which I think that the original infrastructure bill did. A lot of that has been taken out, but we hear a lot about green infrastructure and natural infrastructure, and I think we could think about social and economic infrastructure too, similar to what Amir was talking about. And I mean, really investing in people, ensuring there are support networks and communities, representation, access to housing, schools, transit, healthcare, childcare. That's all connected to climate change and sustainable, resilient cities.
And Amaya, back over to you. What impact might the influx of federal funds from the American Rescue Plan, and of course, if President Biden's infrastructure bill gets passed, what impact might all of that have on helping shape the city and develop it as it goes forward?
Well, I mean, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the city and cities around the country to use this money creatively. Of course, we need to get direct aid to people. So, for instance, in Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot has proposed the largest guaranteed income pilot in the country, which I think can have a major impact on a national conversation about how we strengthen the social safety net so it's not punitive and penalize the poor for being poor. There's a lot of opportunity to build new infrastructure. And, as Sabina, mentioned, I think Chicago and other Great Lakes cities have an opportunity to build real inclusive community because people are going to come here because of climate change. We have water. So we should harness that strength and really think about how we build for the future.
And Louis Betancourt, we've got 30 seconds left, so I'm going to give you the last word here. But what might Chicago or cities look like in 50 years? Are as many people still going to want to live here?
I hope so. I think this is, as we all said, a tremendous opportunity to really take stock, learn, and reinvent cities. The cities of the future will have to be sustainable in the sense that they have greater equity, but they also deal with their energy systems and how they provide services to people in ways that are better for people, for everybody, but also have a different relationship, a constructive relationship with the environment. We don't know how to do that. We have to reinvent it, and we have a tremendous opportunity in the next few years ahead to just do that. So it will require everyone's knowledge and action to be able to do that. And Chicago should be an example for that.
All right, we're going to leave that to you all. My thanks to Amaya Pawar, Sabina Sheck, and Louis Betancourt for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
All right, thanks, Brandis. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, was the January 6th Capitol attack a national security emergency? Author Robert Costa weighs in on this and other inflection points of the presidential transition.
I need 50 votes in the Senate. I have 48.
And the president's signature priorities are being stalled in the Senate by 2 Democrats who are holding out for changes. But for some more of today's top stories, a trial date has been set for a Chicago alderman accused of lying to federal bank regulators and filing false tax returns. 11th Ward Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson is set to stand trial starting October 18th, although news media will not be allowed into the courtroom due to COVID restrictions. Thompson has pleaded not guilty to all charges in connection with the now defunct Washington Federal Bank. That bank was shut down in 2017 by federal regulators after they determined it was insolvent. More developments today in the homicide case involving an Antioch resident and last summer's protests in Kenosha. A judge today declined to dismiss a weapons charge against Kyle Rittenhouse, accused of shooting 3 people and killing 1 during unrest in the wake of the Jacob Blake shooting. Rittenhouse was 17 years old at the time and carrying an AR-15 that he was not legally allowed to have. Rittenhouse's attorneys have argued that he fired in self-defense. Chicago is the best big city in the U.S. for the 5th consecutive year. This coming from the publication Condé Nast Traveler in its annual Reader's Choice Awards. The city is clearly on a hot streak with the magazine's readers. They cite the restaurants, culture, and architecture, as well as friendly residents as reasons for the top billing. Mayor Lightfoot touted the ranking today, saying that the city has simply one-upped itself. And one less state on Chicago's travel advisory list. City officials say Connecticut has been removed because of improving COVID numbers in that state. The advisory now covers 47 states as well as Washington, D.C. Unvaccinated visitors from those places are urged to record a negative COVID test within 72 hours before and after traveling and should quarantine upon their arrival in Chicago. Early in the show, we talked about raising the debt ceiling, and joining us once again to talk about things like regulating Facebook and much more are Representatives Bill Foster, Robin Kelly, Marie Newman, and Mike Quigley. And again, we invited all the Republicans in Illinois' congressional delegation. None accepted our invitation tonight. And again, we thank the 4 of you for being back here. So let's get back to that $3.5 trillion bill, which, as we've acknowledged now, is going to be lower than that. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, one of the holdouts we talked about, he wants the Hyde Amendment back in there, which would ban federally funded abortions. He wants that attached to that spending bill. Congressman Quigley, is that a potential poison pill?
Look, I think there's any number of poison pills, and I think he has to recognize he has a responsibility. This isn't just all the good things that are in this measure. You know, the greatest expense on public infrastructure and human infrastructure in our lifetimes, and to risk it with poison pills now. It'd also risk, the Biden agenda, which is more important, frankly, than, his own office and his election security.
Well, although the senator has said that he's not going to budge on that, Congresswoman Newman, if the Hyde Amendment meant that Democrats would get wins on these other priorities like the child tax credits and community college and climate change provisions, would you take that deal?
Well, let's remember, the Hyde Amendment has no business in this. It's not just a poison pill. It's not germane in any way to anything in the reconciliation package or the Build Back Better package. So it's ridiculous for him to assume that it can go in there. There's any number of procedurals that we can work with to make sure that it doesn't go back in there. And the Hyde Amendment is already law. So it's like doing a double down, which is just ridiculous. So this shenanigan, I don't think will move forward.
Congresswoman Kelly, is that something that could stall the budget bill in the House?
I think it might stall it. It could stall it, but I think that people will see it as a poison pill and just really a detour to where we're trying to get. But again, I think that, as Congresswoman Newman said, it's not even germane, so why is he doing this? But I just think it's a slowdown tactic for him, but in the House, we'll get over that.
And Congressman Foster, we've talked about the two senators, Manchin and Sinema, Manchin mentioning there what he wants. Is it clear to you what Senator Sinema sees as priorities in that social spending bill?
Well, it's less clear. I served with Kirsten for several years on the Financial Services Committee. And it was interesting the different rationales she used from time to time for some of the different positions she took. And so I found that not just for Senator Sinema, but trying to psychoanalyze the Senate generally is not a winning game. So I think you just have to treat it like a black box and hope that in this case, the black box produces a result that's right for the American people.
All right, well, it looks like there's a little psychoanalyzing going on Facebook right now. The whistleblower appeared on Capitol Hill, continuing her testimony that she believes the company has put profits ahead of regulating hate and disinformation on its platform, and it is proving to be a threat to democracy. She says the company won't regulate itself adequately. Congressman Quigley, what exactly can Congress do to regulate this social media giant?
Sure. Look, I think one of the things that was striking and hopeful today was the fact there was bipartisan concern about all of those issues. The Judiciary Committee's been looking at this for over 2 years. There's legislation that addresses it. But as you know, I've served on the House Select Committee on Intelligence for the last 6 years. She was spot on. And they're not the only one here who hasn't gone after disinformation and those who would attack our democratic process.
So, Congressman Foster, there's been talk about referring to Facebook as a monopoly, breaking up those companies, but does the U.S. government have the ability to regulate the content on a platform like this without running afoul of the First Amendment?
Well, we certainly, have a huge club in the form of Section 230, where we've given them a get-out-jail-free, they basically are allowed to editorialize or edit which blog entries which posts that they promote and which they don't. And all of us would love it if the New York Times would always publish our letters to the editor, but they don't always, it turns out. And so, but Facebook can just do whatever they want with what they promote without taking responsibility for it. And so I think we have to look at Section 230 to see if that's leverage that we'll have to end up exploiting it to some extent.
And Congresswoman Newman, I believe that you've been in favor of looking at possibly breaking up the monopoly that some believe Facebook and big tech companies have. Is that something that will be considered on a bipartisan basis, possibly?
I think the first thing we have to do is actually put together a regulatory package that's going to be much more expedient. You have to remember Facebook and other platforms like it are a combination of several industries. They are a content provider, an entertainment vehicle, news, as well as a publisher. And so they should be susceptible to the regulations that those 4 industries represent. So let's start there, because that's a very common sense approach. If in fact they are committing violations against the antitrust laws, then let's take care of that. But let's start with regulatory and get that down, because it's been 25 years since they've had any regulation. So let's get that done.
So it certainly seems the beginning of debate over what a regulatory framework would look like. Congresswoman Kelly, we know that President Biden was set to come to Chicago last week, had to cancel that, now set to come in 2 days. First of all, is this trip going to stay on, and what do you expect from that trip?
I believe the trip is going to stay on. We haven't heard anything different, even though one never knows. But I think he, again, is coming out thanking people who have gotten vaccinated and wanting to encourage those that haven't gotten vaccinated to please do that, because that is the only way we're going to be able to stop COVID-19 if we all do our part. And we in government, I feel, have done our part, sending resources back, to schools, to states, to cities, to towns, to hospitals. But people have to do their part also by getting vaccinated.
All right, Congressman Quigley, I want to move over to the Select Committee on January 6th. As viewers know, we're talking to the author of the book Peril on the show tonight. And there have been subpoenas now from that committee for some of the former president's top advisors, former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, former advisor Steve Bannon. What could investigators learn from that kind of testimony, and will those subpoenas be enforced?
Look, that's a great question at the end. Will those subpoenas be enforced? I mean, the great failure of the Mueller investigation and what Congress attempted to do during the Trump administration was to get our subpoenas answered and get people to testify and to answer our questions. This is a real challenge for Congress to enforce its powers. I believe they will be, but it is not going to be easy. None of these folks are going to come and tell us what that conversation was like between Leader McCarthy and President Trump.
All right, so that might be a stare down amid this other stare down with the debt ceiling, and we'll continue to follow where these negotiations and these talks go over the next several weeks. But for now, our thanks to Representatives Bill Foster, Robin Kelly, Marie Newman, and Mike Quigley. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, as we mentioned, a conversation with the co-author of the new book, Peril. But first, we take a look at the weather. A new book gives an insider, blow-by-blow account of one of the most tumultuous and dangerous presidential transitions in American history. From the chaos of the January 6th Capitol riot to a secret 6-point strategy to overturn the election results. It also details extraordinary actions from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who reportedly had to assure China that former President Donald Trump and the U.S. had no plans to attack it. The book is called Peril by acclaimed Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. And joining us now is Robert Costa, national political reporter at the Washington Post and former host and managing editor of PBS's Washington Week. Robert Costa, thanks for being here on Chicago Tonight.
Paris, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, well, let's start with some of the big revelations in your book. You describe the enormous pressure that Vice President Pence faced in the days leading up to January 6th to overturn the election results instead of certify the election on January 6th. So take us behind the events that led to his final decision.
For Bob Woodward and I, it was a reporting journey because we thought the vice president made this decision in the final few hours, the final days before January 6th. But what we discovered through the course of 9 or 10 months of reporting is that Vice President Pence was consulting with his lawyers, his aides, even former Vice President Dan Quayle. And we try to capture all these different behind-the-scenes endeavors that Pence had to make a decision. Was he going to try to throw the election to Trump by throwing the election to the House of Representatives? Ultimately, he did not. But the kind of pressure he was under, it was so intense.
And part of that pressure came from an obscure lawyer named John Eastman. You revealed this 6-point plan that Eastman had that apparently gave Pence the power to overturn the election results. Just give us the blow-by-blow of what that strategy was.
In as brief a way as possible, what John Eastman, this conservative lawyer, wanted Pence to do is throw out electors to say that Biden wouldn't be able to get the necessary 270 electors to certify his win on January 6th. That means the election goes to the House. And if it went to the House, because Republicans control the most delegations in the House, the Constitution says that's how a vote would be taken if an election ever goes to the House. President Trump would win the 2020 election if it was held in the House of Representatives at the end of the day. That was the roundabout plan that this conservative lawyer was pushing. And it wasn't just chit-chat. This was a memo, 2 pages, 6 points, trying to get Pence to do it. And Eastman, this lawyer, and President Trump confronted Pence on January 4th. What a scene in the book where Trump is saying to Pence, listen to John Eastman. Just listen to him. Do this for me.
And in fact, the president it seems like he's yelling at Vice President Pence, especially when the vice president tells Trump that he's not going to carry through with that plan. You know, over and over in this book, you refer to high-level cabinet officials and other Republicans who are clearly exasperated. They try to divert the president, the former president, from his basest instincts. They even mock him behind his back, yet stick with him publicly. What did they tell you about why they wouldn't speak out more?
Well, one example in the book is Leader McConnell, who despises President Trump. He jokes about President Trump in a mocking way behind the scenes. Yet when it comes to the transition period, we have all these scenes of McConnell saying he doesn't want to have a public fight with Trump because he needs Trump's help in the Georgia runoff Senate elections. And you see this throughout the Republican Party in the book. They believe President Trump is central to the GOP keeping power, to acquiring power in the future. And so they don't want to have a war with him, even if they don't like him.
And it's also clear in the book that most of them, except for some of the most extreme elements of Trump's inner circle, don't believe any of the claims of election fraud, yet they continue to indulge them. Did they ever tell you that they knew that this was doing damage to democracy, undermining people's faith in elections?
Some of them acknowledge that the president was lying about fraud, that this is not based on facts. And we see the president's efforts were blocked in the courts constantly. The courts did not conclude there was any fraud. You didn't see the DOJ concluding there was any kind of widespread fraud. Yet this claim of a stolen election persists. It's become a rally cry inside the Republican Party. And it may even be the central plank for Trump if he runs again in 2024. So you don't have a lot of Republicans wanting to contest it, but we show behind the scenes Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Mike Lee, 2 Trump allies, conservatives. Graham, for his part, was effective in showing that there was no fraud. He had his whole staff look at whether there was fraud, found nothing. And Senator Mike Lee was trying to see if this Eastman plan was viable or real. And he thought, based on his own reporting on the side as a senator making calls, that there was nothing to it. So we try to show, not in our words or our conclusions, but our reporting, and Republicans even show that what the president was trying to do was just not backed up by reality.
And none of them seem conflicted by the fact that it is leading to this real erosion of trust in elections in the country.
And that's what the whole book Peril is about, is all of these things that happen inside the Oval Office, on phone calls, in private, they have consequences. When things don't get stopped behind the scenes, a democracy can be tested. There was an insurrection at the Capitol, and peril does remain at times because of decisions people make. And this book is about decisions and how they are made, and to try to give people an understanding of Washington that you don't always know on the surface what's happening. Sometimes it takes months to get a clear understanding of what the truth is.
And speaking of understanding the truth and the riots on January 6th, does your reporting reveal any more as to why the security was so minimal that day and why it took so long to call in the National Guard?
It's evident that what happened on January 6th was a grave intelligence failure. The U.S. military, the national security community did not predict this kind of insurrection. Our book shows in detail what was happening inside the Pentagon. on the days before January 6th and after, they feared maybe an attack on the Capitol from the sky. There could be some kind of random attack, but they never thought that a mob of people would storm the Capitol. And for people at the highest ranks of the military, this was a failure, akin to previous significant and dire national security failures.
And as you know, the House Select Committee on January 6th has subpoenaed folks like former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, former advisor Steve Bannon. What do you expect investigators could learn from their possible testimony?
Well, not to be self-referential, but those subpoenas cite this book, Peril, by name. The subpoena issued to Steve Bannon and the subpoena issued to former Trump advisor Dan Scavino both cite this book because we have scenes that show Bannon talking to Trump, which Bannon has publicly acknowledged he did, saying he wants to kill the Biden presidency in the crib and that the focus in late December, Bannon said to Trump, must be on January 6th. And Dan Scavino, the social media director, was with President Trump all throughout the evening on January 5th, the night before the insurrection. So this committee, this select committee, wants to find out more about what was going on, because so much of January 6th is not about just the response that day by President Trump and others. It's about the pressure campaign in the days prior. The New York Times called it, rightly so, in reference to our book, a bloodless but really important legal and political battle before the 6th.
And we'll have to see if those subpoenas are complied with or enforced. You know, your book also chronicles the Biden transition and Biden's first few months in office, including the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. So did your reporting reveal any more insight as to why the president apparently chose not to heed advice from some top defense leaders that wanted to keep a small troop presence in Afghanistan?
Our reporting shows that President Biden was very much formed by his previous experiences in the Obama administration. In 2009, he did not want to see the surge of troops, 30,000 into Afghanistan. He thought the military was asking for too much. And he was almost ridiculed at the time within the administration for taking that position. And he's always felt like the military, when it comes to Afghanistan, wants too many troops and the war is never ending. And this goes back to his days on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so as William Faulkner often said, the past is never past. It's not even past. And that comes to policymaking with Joe Biden. His past certainly informed his decision to withdraw all U.S. troops, despite the reservations from Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin, who wanted a slower withdrawal. And all of that's detailed in our book, important details for history that a few voices did speak up, at least early on, and say, slow down.
And it certainly became a flashpoint of controversy early on in the Biden administration here. And now you've talked about the future of the GOP. You mentioned Senator Lindsey Graham believes that the party needs to stay with Trump as its leader. Mitch McConnell, at least right after the election, believed the party should completely divorce itself. How do you believe this is going to play out ahead of the midterms?
You have a party where Trump is front and center. He's going back to Iowa, the first voting state in the 2024 contest this coming week. You see Trump out there having rally after rally, using a warlike cadence, never surrender, never give in. He has immense political capital. The polling bears that out. So even if the Republican Party and someone like Mitch McConnell, the GOP leader in the Senate, wants to move on, well, it's not easy to move on because he's out there and he's galvanizing his supporters in the states to get involved, to run for positions in the local election board, the state election board. He wants an even bigger say in how elections are run in this country. It's not an ending story. This Peril may end as a book, but the peril to American democracy, the threat to the fabric that holds it together, very much present.
Well, that was going to be my last question for you, Robert. What is your assessment based on, you've been covering Washington a long time, you've spoken to the president a lot, you speak to Congress members all the time. What is your assessment of the threat level to future free and fair elections and to the foundations of democracy?
Well, there's clearly a fear on the Democratic side. Jim Clyburn, the House Majority Whip, says in her book that democracy's on fire, and he believes Republicans are taking sweeping action in the states that's going to corrode voting rights. But many Republicans say they're just putting new laws in that are very, very well fine and legal. And this is a real divide about how elections in this country should be conducted. There's no consensus between the parties in any real way. And this is I'm just a reporter, but this portends for some very tense elections in 2022 and 2024. about what's legitimate. And think about how close we came on January 6th to the vice president walking away and saying, this isn't a legitimate election. I can't certify it. Democracy was tested, and there's no reporting yet that says it's not going to be tested again.
All right, there's a lot to follow, and Robert Costa, we're glad you're in Washington documenting all these things, although you're in Chicago this week, so thank you so much for joining us.
I only wish I could be with you, and hopefully we can see a concert soon. I know you love live music as much as you love politics.
Yeah, we're going to have to go catch the dead or something like that down the road. All right, thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
And again, the book is called Peril by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, and we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Politics nerds, music nerds. And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Although the city is adding bike lanes, some say there is more to do to make cycling equitable.
And as the White Sox head to the playoffs, we discuss the impact of the Latino presence in baseball. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.